Okay, it looks like we are live. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. You are watching the OpenJS Foundation Ask Me Anything. This month, we are with the Node.js Technical Steering Committee. And we will be joined by reps from the Technical Steering Committee and Michael Dawson, who will be moderating the panel. So I am going to hand it over to Michael in just a second. But before I do, you're probably wondering how you might want to ask some questions to these fine folks. And there's a few ways. So you can either tag us on Twitter, or you can go to the YouTube channel and you can use the chat function there to ask some questions. So I'm going to hand it on over to Michael to get things started.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. We're just going to start out with a few introductions. I'm Michael Dawson, IBM's community lead for Node.js, and that means I get to spend quite a bit of time working with all the great people in the community, including the Technical Steering Committee, the Community Committee, and a bunch of the working groups and so forth. And one of the things I do get to do as part of that is I'm currently the TSC chair. And I think at this point, Colin, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Hi, everyone. So my name's Colin Yeard. I'm currently an engineering manager at Jeaious, building some fun cloud services with Samsung. I've been involved with the Node project since 2014 or 15, I think. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this panel.
Thanks. Bethany, you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Beth. I work at IBM in the Node.js runtime team. I've been there for about 4 years, and I'm mainly active within the Node.js release working group in the Node community.
Thank you. Matteo?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matteo Collina, member of the TSC for, I don't know, from 2017 or something like that. I mainly focus on, I've been using Node since Node 0.2, something around those lines. And I've been contributing to Node since the first Node Interactive some time ago.
Thanks.
Jeaious?
Oh.
Yeah, no, that's it.
Okay, thanks.
By the way, I work for Nearform. I work for Nearform. Hey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Girish. I work for IBM. Been involved with Node.js since 2013. Started by contributing to porting of Node.js onto AIX platforms, and part of the TSC for the last 1.5 years. My main focus area is diagnostics, and I'm also active in the Node.js help repo.
Thanks. Miles?
Hi, I'm Miles. Been on the Node TSC for, I guess, about 4 years, maybe. I got active in the project just after the merger of IOJS and Node.js. I currently work for Google in the open source programs office, and I'm quite active in the Node project as well as TC39.
Thanks. Gabriel?
Hey all, I'm Gabriel. I work at Intel, and I've been working with Node, 2015-ish or so, 14, 15. I mostly work on native add-ons, helped bring an API to light, which I'm really happy to see is working really well. And most recently, I've also been working on optimization of Node.js with the runtime large pages flag, so people can just add a flag and hopefully their stuff will run faster.
Okay, thanks. And just a reminder for the viewers, if you have any questions, you can tag us on Twitter through the OpenJS at OpenJSFF handle, or you can use the comment function on YouTube as well. So we'll start out with a few questions that we had in advance. And the first one is that, Node.js has been really proactive about adding new people to its ranks of maintainers, TSC members. Why do we think that's important, and what advice do we have for, either for projects who need to add maintainers or contributors who may want to become a maintainer one day? Maybe Gabriel, can you start us out on that one?
Sure. So what I've noticed in Node.js is that as we add new folks, and as we notice their contributions and offer them collaboratorship, they bring aboard not just with the project as it is, but they bring aboard new perspectives, and they inform us of the direction it should be going ultimately. So first, it always starts out small, and eventually people become more and more involved, and there's this immediate feedback that we get, because we begin to understand the direction in which they are going, and how that jives with where Node.js is going. And so we have an opportunity here to not only benefit from their contributions, but to also stay abreast of where the community is going. That's very important. So, and in terms of advice for potential collaborators, just stick with it, and it's going to happen. I mean, obviously we're not perfect, and we cannot, it's not going to happen in a given time frame, but that's been my experience sort of coming aboard Node.js as well, is that sooner or later people will notice your contributions, and you'll become part of the community. So that's as far as I can tell my advice.
So I know, Beth, I think you've done some specific mentoring and so forth on the release side. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's something we started trialing out at the start of the year after the last Collaborator Summit in December. And because the building of a release and auditing the commits is kind of an art that you need to learn by kind of shadowing and mentoring, what we've done is we've set up a hour-long session every 2 weeks where anyone who's interested in getting involved in the release working group can join in and kind of just watch us go through the process of preparing a release, and also look at us, follow us along, auditing all of the commits ready for the release. And we've had quite a few participants regularly attending that one. And that's in addition to the release working group calls. So the release working group calls are open for everyone. So that's kind of the approach we're kind of trialing out and release, and we'll probably see how it goes and keep it going.
Thanks. Yes, my thoughts on some advice to other maintainers is, I think the Node project has very much optimized for what I might call the good case. Is we expect people to act in a responsible manner, and sort of given that trust, they do. So as opposed to optimizing to sort of protect for the absolute worst case, we've set up things so that we try to be very receptive. We try and give people access and make them collaborators earlier rather than later. And I think we found that actually has worked pretty well in terms of things, and it's sort of a good approach versus being in a defensive mode, more being in the, hey, we think these new people are going to generally want to help, and by doing that, it gives them a better opportunity to do that. Does anybody else have any thoughts, things they want to add on this one?
Yeah, just a couple of messages for the potential collaborators or new contributors who want to become maintainers of the project. Probably look around for wider problems, look around for some patterns of issues, look at the backlog. We always have a good amount of issues sitting in the backlog, waiting for people to come in and fix or put their hands on. Then over the time, you can actually find some sweet spot, which is a combination of the requirement of the project plus your skills and interest. Because it's a project which has spanning in multiple languages and technologies like C, C++, JavaScript, and Python, and things like that. It's always good to find a sweet spot where you are productive and it matches the requirement of the project as well. And then try to engage in a consistent as well as visible manner, basically with the other collaborators and contributors to improve the overall efficiency and meeting the need of the project. So that's a proven path towards becoming collaborators and eventually TSC members.
Miles, I think you had something to add. Nope.
Yeah, just a small thing. Getting involved in Node is not always just getting involved in Node core, which is what we call the Node.js/Node repo. There's a lot of different places where people can get involved in things in which they can help out with. So a really great place to get started is often the Node.js.org or Node.js.dev websites, which have a lot of places where people can jump in and help. People have jumped in with internationalization, as Girish said, the help repo. There's a number of different places where people can get involved and help the project. So just wanted to encourage folks to kind of think broadly. In general, the best way to get involved is to fix things that are broken, that you're aware are broken. And usually kind of getting started with like, hey, this is spelled wrong on the website is even like a really great place to get involved and help out. Every little bit helps.
Matteo?
So yeah, I would just want to add that joining some of the more joining Node Core can be daunting on certain subsystems. There are especially some systems that requires a lot of knowledge and background knowledge, a lot of understanding how the internal work to be able to be productive contributors. And the only suggestion is to keep being consistent and ask questions, go improve the docs, or just even fix small bugs and try to fix those small bugs. And it might take a month to land a change that might sound tiny, but in fact is way harder. I would note that there is several areas that needs a little bit more help. Some of which are the HTTP team, HTTP2 team, streams are a critical part of the Node.js that have some maintainers, but they always require new people to help, and because also some of the issues are actually hard. Like there's no good fix to some of them. Like you need to cast a trade-off between a lot of various opportunities. So
yeah,
that's
maybe I'll just close out with, I think picking an area is a really good suggestion from Jeaious, and to call out a few others is like, there's the package maintenance team, there's the NAPI team, the modules team. There's some, so there's some good areas. There's a list of strategic initiatives that are also good candidates on the off the TSC README. And I guess, yeah, that's just the last thing I wanted to add. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question we have here is, what's the Node.js version that I should use? And when should I update from one LTS to another? I think Colin, you had some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think the short answer is, if you're a company, you should always be running the latest LTS version. And usually the best time to upgrade is before whatever version you're on goes end of life. Different companies will have different constraints on how they can do that. But generally, you want to be running a long-term support branch release, and you want to upgrade to the latest, because there's often an overlap where there'll be two LTS releases at the same time. That was my short answer. The longer answer is, it kind of depends on how much risk you're willing to tolerate and dealing with bugs. So if it's very important to you that you have the latest and greatest features, and it's okay if you encounter the occasional regression from time to time, then you can run the current release branch. But just be warned that things do break there. If you just look back through all of the release blog posts, you'll see this a release and then a quick follow-up release in another day or two to fix a regression. So that's something you have to kind of weigh the trade-offs with. But if you're a company making money off of Node, I would definitely recommend sticking to LTS.
Matteo?
From my point of view, it's one of the things that's very important. It's if you are authoring a module on and publish it on NPM, I would highly recommend that you treat dropping support of a Node.js release line as a Semver major change. We do so in Node.js for our dependencies. So if there is a breaking change, we do in one of our libraries, for example, for an ABI change or something like that, we do not break you. So it will be a nice and favor that you can do to your own users to not break them in a minor release if they are depending on an old LTS line.
Any other thoughts, comments on that question from anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, just completely agree with Matteo. I've been working with a lot of customers on production issues, so I really know the pattern of the customer's mindset about don't migrate as long as you don't have any issue. Probably that's not a good idea, because if you don't migrate between LTS versions, one of the challenge when it comes to you actually come for migration is a huge gap in terms of your code base and the current feature set in the target. So it's always recommended to evaluate the current LTS version and look at your product's lifecycle roadmap with respect to the feature implementation and find a suitable time to migrate from LTS to LTS.
Yeah, I think we definitely want people to try out the current and give us feedback, so that when it does, for example, when the even currents become LTS, we've already got some testing. But running on the LTS is what makes sense. I guess the other thing to Colin's point about if you want to test the latest, you could use the current. Just be aware that those only have a 6-month life cycle. So if you do that, you're going to have to sign up to updating more often as well than you will with the LTSs that get the 30-month support.
I think one thing that I would add there as well is a pattern that I have seen people do that is not great is launching a product on an LTS release and then never even updating that LTS release. So even within like the same release line, if you're on V10 or V12, I think it's really important to be kind of monitoring the releases of Node and following that and making sure that you're rolling out new updates to your services as we roll out releases. For LTS, we have about a monthly cadence. So about you could prepare for about a release about once a month and updating your stack. In general, we try to make sure that what we land is stable. If you wanted to play it extra safe, you could always delay by one release. That's how I update my Mac OS operating system personally. So I no hard feelings if you want to be off by one. That's a great way to make sure that if there are any regressions that are found, you're not going to be hit by them. Generally, if there are bugs that are found in LTS, we tend to, if they are experience breaking bugs, get those fixed within a day or two. We're really, really quick about getting a patch release out when we break things on release lines. So even if you just delayed by about 2 weeks, you have a pretty high probability of making sure that you're not going to introduce new regressions. Keeping up to date with kind of the latest release on whatever release line that you're using is going to ensure that you're not going to have larger jumps to do, especially if a security release comes out. Keeping up to date will kind of ensure that you're slowly migrating so that if we ever do have to do a larger security release, which could end up introducing Semver major changes in a Semver minor release if we have to break APIs in order to make them more secure, which we have done before. It would be the least amount of work for your team to be able to focus solely on that. and be able to kind of slowly integrate things. I won't get too much into like testing and deploy infrastructure, but there's really great patterns you can use, like blue-green deploy. You can do all sorts of staged rollouts. Tools like Kubernetes or different clouds have all sorts of awesome tools so that you can kind of slowly roll things out and test them. The way that we find bugs is by people rolling things out in production. So you also don't need to roll this out all at once. But I really do advise folks to try to stay up to date on the release lines that they are, and it will make such a huge difference in just kind of like feeling pain when eventually there's an update that you absolutely need.
Yeah, it's a good point, because like in our security releases, we work to making it such that the security release only includes the security fixes, so that if you're at the latest point version before that, you know the only thing you're getting is the security fixes, and to minimize your overall risk of like quickly moving to that. But that doesn't really help if you're like, a couple of Semver minor or patch releases behind, because you're going to have to move up across all of those. So that's a very good point there.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, we don't patch all the previous Semver minors. Our LTS releases move forward. We don't maintain multiple minors. So if there is a security release and you're not kind of sitting at the tip of that release tree, you're going to be forced to update, for lack of a better way to put it. One small thing that I will add is, in general, our Semver patches tend to be much more kind of like stable and reliable, in the sense that like the things that are landing are usually like fixes. But when you're kind of thinking about the cadence and rolling things out, maybe adding a little bit of extra time for testing and rolling out Semver minor releases, even on LTS, is probably prudent.
I think, Colin, you had something you wanted to add?
So it's more of a question to everyone else on the panel. Does anyone have a take on FIPS and how that's impacting users? I know I've seen customers who have been stuck on Node 8, which has been end of life for months now, but they can't upgrade because they're required to support FIPS, and there's no FIPS story in any of the currently supported release lines. So one approach I've seen customers take is to set up support contracts with the OpenSSL project regarding that. I was just curious if anyone else has encountered that in their companies. So
I can answer on. We're certainly watching that as a project. Sam Roberts, who works with us, we're tracking what's going on with OpenSSL 3. I think as you probably know, it's end of this year is kind of like an optimistic best case of when something might come from the OpenSSL project. So it's not a place we'd want to be in terms of the community release. Once we can move up to OpenSSL 3, we'll be looking to pull that in. There are only a few alternatives. I think some of the distributions offer their own FIPS certified version. I know Red Hat, one of our associated companies, ships their own crypto module, which the node that ships on Red Hat gives you FIPS. So there's a way to get it, but you're going to have to be looking at the particular distros in some cases to be able to do that today.
Thank you.
I think unless anybody has something to add on that, we'll move on to the next question. No? Okay. So the next question that we had was, what's being done to improve the use of CPU cores? Do you ever foresee Golang like channels or Go routines being used? I think, Jeaious, you had some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it's an interesting topic. Basically, when you look at the CPU cores, the basic premise of throughput and performance being a function of CPU core is a basic premise in most of the programming languages. But when it comes to Node.js, being in JavaScript, which follows an asynchronous and event-driven architecture, do not necessarily align with that premise. And instead, it actually leverages the high level of concurrency inherent in the language and the platform to influence the throughput or the performance characteristics. So the single answer is. In most of the workloads and production systems which I looked at, if you see around 100% of the CPU consumption from any other language, it might be scary. Whereas if it is a Node.js deployment, it may be business as usual. It would be as simple as the entire CPU slot allotted to the process is being exploited because of the way the asynchronous event-driven architecture is leveraged by the program. However, when the workload increases beyond proportions, it's so possible that the single CPU overconsumption or utilization model is still not enough. And you would look at scalability aspect in both vertical and horizontal dimension. So few options which are inbuilt in the core are, one is child process, which is a raw implementation of replicating your code into different child process and dealing with communication, synchronization, and data sharing between sibling processes or parent and child processes by yourself. So I would say child process is the primitive mechanism for exploitation of multi-core. And then comes the clusters, which is a sophisticated abstraction on top of the child process, whereas the communication, synchronization, and load balancing between the cluster members are taken care by the API itself. But then how the transaction has to be laid out in terms of the workflow is still at the hand of the application. For example, how do you manage the session? Is not in the purview of the cluster. And then you have the worker threads, which is a new addition to this family, which looks at running JavaScript workload in the same process, but in a different thread by sharing the process address space, but not sharing the isolate, the unit of execution in the JavaScript context. None of these things are probably competitors to each other, but basically look at different use cases and workload scenarios to see which one suits the perfect combinations. So from that perspective, coroutines and the other semantics of the Golang, which is the channels, I would say is another abstraction on top of the basic threading models. So it's possible that we implement that as well, but eventually the question is that synchronization, the sharing of the data, and the communication between different threads. How are you able to deal with that? What is the sophistication you are able to bring to the table, and how the users are able to cope with that? So the answer lies in that.
Matteo?
Thank you, Michael. So there is a couple of things to be said that I want to add. One of the things that Node.js shines on is at building small to some extent servers and scale them horizontally. So I would say that should definitely be their the best way to scale a Node.js process, and versus using child processing or other things. And I am recommending this because it's this has been proven to work for years. So I don't think why that will, any new API that we'll add will change. In fact, it creates a better, it reduces cost and footprint on the cloud to have multiple small servers versus massive servers with 32 cores or something. So from a usability, from a scalability perspective, I think it's way better. Anyway, related to what Jeaious said, you can use right now, there is a few modules to use worker threads as queue system. So if you need to have some long running CPU process, you can actually offload it so you can keep your main thread lightweight and without blocking the event loop. So that's it, and it works very well. It's very stable and very performant. So I think with a combination of all of those, it's actually very, very good. Personally, I do not recommend to use cluster for the cluster module, for example, and I think I prefer to rely on cloud providers or Kubernetes and so on to scale my node processes up. So I think this is infrastructure. It's an infrastructure concern, not an application concern, at least from what for what I've seen.
Yeah, I can even add to that as well, Matteo. I think there's a lot of interesting questions about like at what layer some of these problems should be solved. And I think there is a lot of strong evidence, and it doesn't mean that this is the case for every deployment or implementation, but that scale and load balancing is not an application layer concern. And there's even some really cool stuff if you look at like the Kubernetes and Istio community around like policy and some things also around like TLS that arguably can be handled at a cluster level as opposed to in Node itself. So it doesn't mean that this is the only way to solve it, nor that like, am I advocating that everyone should immediately jump on the Kubernetes train. But in general, it's really interesting to kind of think about some of these problems as meta problems so that they get teased out of Node itself. So managing and terminating SSL as just one example, as the kind of thing that can happen outside of your Node application altogether, removes a lot of logic and also potential for error. So that's one of the things Istio is really great at, is managing policy across many, many services. And so if you have, like one monolithic application, then yeah, maybe it makes sense for all these things to live. But if you're thinking a lot more around the microservice approach to things, you really can start teasing a lot of things out of your Node application, which I think allows for better auditability, consistency, and maintenance for your whole suite of applications, not just a single application.
Colin, I think you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I can kind of echo that as far as the point of view of using small single core servers. That generally works really well. I've had experience with it at very large companies, for example, Walmart. Using single core servers, they scale out horizontally more easily. And then you're also not taking on the bugs of whatever is in the cluster module. I've also worked at companies that tried to use the cluster module and it didn't work very well. I also used to be one of the maintainers of the cluster module, so I can say that you should not use it. So that was speaking to the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, do you ever foresee Golang-like channels and Go routines? I think if it was going to be syntax and part of the language, that would be a question for TC39 and not this group. But I would imagine you could implement something similar to Go routines now using worker threads and building your own NPM module. So if that was something you were interested in, I would encourage people to go experiment.
Yeah, and I guess just adding to the discussion of whether to use the like scale using the infrastructure, we had at least one fairly large Node internal deployment where they'd started doing their own load balancing, moved to Kubernetes, and we're wondering if they should continue to have that within the containers, because for other languages and runtimes you can end up with larger nodes than you would for Node. And we suggested that they just stick to a single node instance per node, and it turned out that ended up being the feedback in the end is that worked out better for them in terms of performance and so forth. So just some real life experience that confirms that too. So let's move on to the next question. The next question is Node, will Node be good for image processing applications used as a backend? Gabriel, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that?
This is actually kind of a good segue because we were just talking about the various options people have for scaling, right? And so the picture that comes into my mind is that we've listed all these different solutions for basically scaling for a given application, but ultimately I think what is needed for any given use case is experimentation. And I know it's an process to switch from one architecture to another, but basically what I'm thinking is that, you know, if you need scaling, especially for things like image processing, right, then you have to decide for yourself where the bottleneck is, right? So if you can solve it with a single process and offload the image processing to a worker thread, and that gets you the highest throughput, then so be it. If it turns out that the memory consumption is such that it's mostly the node process, then maybe you'll want to switch to using a single process, because then the code can be shared. So it depends a lot on your use case, and I think image processing is one of these use cases. So I cannot suggest a best case architecture off the top of my head for image processing, but basically we now have an additional tool with worker thread beyond just cluster and child processes, and you having the orchestration perform the scaling. So if it works, then use it. And of course, it also adds a little bit to the experimentation. So you need to be agile about that. It's definitely, worker threads are definitely a sort of an emerging possibility, because JavaScript has been single-threaded for a very long time, but that's not true for many programming languages, right? So a lot of them support threading right off the bat, and JavaScript hasn't. So if you're coming in from a different programming environment, then you may be now breathing a sigh of relief. Though of course you always have to check, and the performance of your solution always has to keep you grounded. So. But at least now we're sort of joining the ranks of those languages which support threading in the box, and we'll see what the implications are as these things develop, and as more and more applications that were previously threaded are now being attempted in JavaScript. So that's it on my.
Matteo, I think you had some thoughts too.
I just wanted to add. There are huge ways. So I've built this type of systems. I think I built 3 types of those systems with Node.js for essentially image processing in the cloud. I back in 2011, 2012, I built a service to do live cropping of images, similar to one that most services now offer to some extent. That's actually pretty, and that works pretty beautifully, essentially using image processing tools that are off the shelf, essentially ImageMagick or GraphicsMagick, something like that, and just putting Node on top of those, even just putting Node on top of the binaries themselves. Pretty great. That worked so well. Now, very recently, you can also use Node for taking screenshots, for example, of web pages. We have done these with, I think it was Puppeteer or something like that. Even running something on headless Chrome on Lambda, something like completely, that stuff that was completely unfeasible before. And pretty good. Like it works well. It works well from my point of view. It works well. I was just reporting that we have used this in so many occasions, and I never got any issue whatsoever.
Yeah, I guess while you were talking, I was just thinking that, yeah, it's often that you're using Node to bring together the overall solution, even though the image processing itself is done in existing, like ImageMagick or something that's written in another language. I know that some of the work that Gabriel's been doing to help threads and workers work better with native modules is actually something that might help on that front too, where you'd be able to use some of those native modules and image processing components from the worker threads themselves.
Oh, right. Yes, the thread safe function, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just to elaborate a little bit on that, the thread safe function is basically used when you have a module that is multi-threaded already, and you wish for it to interact with Node.js. So you can basically get to the point where you receive a function from Node.js which you can call, and since you cannot normally call such a function from any given thread, but only from the Node.js main thread, this particular construct will allow you to make an asynchronous call from any thread. So you can use your existing threading implementation on the native side and just pass in basically what is a JavaScript function that you can call. So if you have a multi-threaded image processing application already written in a native language, then you can now integrate it far more easily with Node.js.
Okay, sounds good. Colin, I think you want to add something?
Just something very brief. Another alternative, since we are using Node.js, instead of using a native compiled add-on, would be to use something like WebAssembly. So you could compile down to WebAssembly ahead of time, and then image and signal processing applications tend to do a lot of like vector and array-based operations. So that's something that WebAssembly can do pretty quickly.
Okay, thanks. So I think we should move on to the next question. I think people are curious about, what the upcoming 14.x release, which is later this month. Bethany, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So for the 14x release is due to go out on the 21st of April, and it will be going into LTS in October. So that's when you should start thinking about maybe migrating your production applications up to 14. For the first 6 months, it will be in the current state, so it will pick up all new features that land on master. Some of the new features going into 14 at the moment are the V8 upgrades. There's a lot of streams changes going into 14x, and moving some of the kind of long-term doc deprecated APIs to end of life. In terms of the release itself, there are some release candidates out there. So if you were really keen and wanted to kind of test it out in advance, you can navigate to the PR. I can paste a link somewhere after this, and you'd be able to pick it up and try it out.
Okay, thanks. Sounds good. Anybody else want to add something to that before we move on to the next question? Okay, so the next question we have
actually,
is, sorry, go ahead.
One quick question.
Yep.
Beth, I believe that we've made changes to the release policy for LTS. How does that affect 14 and 12?
So previously a release would be in active LTS for 18 months and then switch to maintenance for 12 months. But recently we made the decision to swap that, which means now a release, so both 12 and 14 will only be in active LTS for 12 months, and they will be in maintenance for 18 months. So the whole lifetime of the release is still the same amount of time. We've just flipped the active LTS and the maintenance timeframes.
Okay, that's good to know. Any other questions, comments before we move on to the next question? Okay, so the next question we've got is, what do you think about Dino?
I love it. I think the more runtimes, the better. It's definitely like a complicated question, and I think that there's individuals who like to try to frame things as like mutually exclusive or one versus the other. I'm a huge fan of the concept of abundance thinking. The more the merrier, the better. I think about this especially in regards to some of the work that I do at TC39. Node has been one of the sole non-browser based vendors that have been discussing changes to the language. And with the introduction of Deno and Moddable and a number of other JavaScript runtimes that are not browsers, Cloudflare Edge Workers also falls into this place. There is more voices for us at TC39 for other use cases. It also helps us as Node, in my personal opinion, identify things that are not specific to our runtime, but are a bit of kind of more specific to the server side or non-browser use case, which helps us identify things that should be standardized across multiple implementations. A really great example of one of the things right now that's being discussed is import meta around all the different environments, and an API such as import meta resolve. Folks who have maybe used something like require resolve for building paths and understanding like relative paths to your module, you don't have access to such a feature in ESM. And there's a lot of work going on in kind of finding use cases that make sense across multiple runtimes. I think personally, like Deno is getting close to a 1.0 release, which is also exciting. They've managed to pull it off a lot faster than Node did. But numbers are cheap, in my personal opinion. So getting to a 1.0 release as soon as possible is really great for the growth of a project. So you can actually have all of the different versions, so you can really tell people what's going on. I would personally prefer if people stop some of the rhetoric that one runtime will kill the other, or that one runtime is better than the other. These are all tools that have different use cases and reasons for using them, and I think that it's a big benefit to our entire ecosystem. I think the biggest challenge that we'll see moving forward is making sure that all of these different runtimes work together. And I have had ongoing conversations with Ryan, Burt, and other folks from the Deno team, especially around the ESM implementation, to ensure that like our ecosystem of modules that are sitting on top of us will be able to work between all of our different environments and not have to kind of pick a favorite.
Colin, did you want to add to that?
So kind of to echo what Miles said, I would love it if people would stop kind of trying to pit Node against Deno. It's not really a fair comparison. So for example, I've seen numbers posted about how much faster Deno can start up than Node. But over the course of 10 years, a lot of people have a lot of feature requests and those things start to pile up. So eventually I would imagine Deno will also start to slow down. But on the positive side, there are actually a lot of things from there that I would love to see Node adopt. I would love to have a built-in test runner. I would love to have, a built-in bundler, things that when Node originally started, it was kind of the minimal core approach. And it seems like Deno, even though it's from the same person, has kind of flipped that a little bit, and now it's kind of more of a kitchen sink approach. And I think a lot of people, not just myself, would really appreciate having access to those types of features built into the runtime.
Matteo, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to play on one of the key difference between Deno and Node, and which is the difference in the module system, which is very significant. It seems out of scope for Deno to support the NPM ecosystem, and they just rely on HTTP URLs. And from my personal point of view is that it's the NPM ecosystem and Node modules has been one of the key success of Node.js. So technically it's a fantastic project, but I'm not seeing how it will exactly span out because of that lack of support, essentially.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that question?
Yep, I just want to add a couple of things. One is asynchronous event-driven programming via the pioneers, Node.js. That also comes with some kind of problems. For example, some of the features, some of the capabilities, we don't have a specification. The way the feature works itself becomes the standard. For example, the streams, the HTTP protocols, or the promises. These are the kind of things which got matured in the community over the time based on the use cases and the workload. I don't know much about the Deno other than the fact that it's a TypeScript based backend platform, but having a similar platform with similar objective and capabilities is going to definitely improve the overall features, as well as help standardizing and building specifications around features and capabilities which are derived from event-driven architecture, which is good for the overall ecosystem, in my opinion.
Any other thoughts? Okay, if not, let's move on to the next question. The next question was, the Yarn v2 module resolution looks promising and brings massive change to the ecosystem. Thoughts about that? It seems like nobody wants to jump in necessarily on that one. I guess I've heard there's certainly concerns over the impact it will have to the ecosystem, but I honestly haven't looked in enough details to have a really good opinion.
I can add just like a small bit here, which is that, like, at least from the Node.js modules team's perspective, we are not looking like outside of browsers and Node itself as far as making decisions about our resolution algorithm. The resolution algorithm that we have for ES modules is heavily based on capabilities that can be matched to specifically the import map proposal that's being done over in WICG, the YCG, which is a W3C incubator. The plan and hope is to allow like what is written in Node ESM modules to be more or less compatible with the browser modules without requiring a build step, simply through metadata. We are working on making sure that our loaders implementation will allow various individuals within the ecosystem to build custom things. So Yarn plug and play, Tink, Webpack, Babel, these were all use cases that we looked at, explored, and thought about in designing and in the continued design of the loaders. But as far as the Node modules team is concerned, the baseline resolution algorithm that we have is going to be absolutely minimal. We've actually been removing things from the algorithm, not adding things, but we are trying to make first-class support for extensions in Node so that people can work, more hand in hand with Node itself, as opposed to some of the hackier things that have been done in the past in the common JS loader.
Thanks. Okay, sounds like that's what we have for that question. We're down to the last 5 minutes, and I guess I was thinking maybe we could use this to either let each of the panelists give a short, if there's one more topic they'd sort of like to let people know about, or spend the couple minutes in terms of like how you got involved in Node, and any suggestions for people who might be thinking, hey, I want to do that and possibly get work to become a TSC member. So maybe Bethany, you can start.
Sure, I'll start with how I got involved with Node. So the way I got involved with Node is the team I worked at IBM had maintained their own port of Node. And then by running our own builds, we ran tests, and then by triaging the test results, I found out that some of the tests were a bit flaky. And from there, we started contributing flaky test fixes, etc. A bit later on, I think Miles offered to help mentor me along with Gibson into the release working group. That was kind of a one-to-one mentoring sessions every 2 weeks, similar to what we're running now. and that got me more up to scratch with like how to build a release, and that's how I've continued to contribute there. So again, if anyone else wanted to get involved and saw release as an interesting route, joining those bi-weekly meetings is a good way of getting involved.
Great, thanks. Maybe Gabriel? Oh, we may have lost Gabriel.
No,
sorry, there you go. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, my path was a gradual one. I started working with jQuery Mobile, and I was a contributor there. And it turns out their build system runs Node.js. And so sooner or later, I went from writing JavaScript for the browser to writing JavaScript for the build system for jQuery Mobile. And then we got involved with IoT. And so I kind of somebody walked up to me and said, "Hey, you know Node.js, right? We're doing this IoT thing, and it's using Node.js." And I'm like, "Yes, ish." But either way, so then I got to working with Node.js full time, writing bindings for a C library that was used in an IoT stack called IoT Node, and basically it's into working on the native add-on subsystem itself. And so just at the same time, we had an API sort of becoming a thing, both for supporting multiple engines, that is JavaScript engines, and for providing stability for native add-ons, so that you don't have to re-release your native add-on every time a new Node version comes out. And so that was kind of a segue for me. I ended up contributing a lot to an API, and that's what basically the other collaborators noticed, and eventually took me on as a collaborator, and then later on as a TSC member. So that has been the path for me, and I think for many other people too, is to start contributing by the way, and then it becomes your major area of focus as time goes on.
Okay, thanks. I think those are two good stories that reinforce some of the suggestion earlier of like finding a niche area and focusing on that. But it seems like we're at the end of the hour, so I think we should probably close out at this point. Thank you to all the viewers, and we hope to see you in the next AMAs, and I'm sure we'll do this as a TSC again sometime in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.